Hello and welcome to the Presto Classical Podcast. After foreign excursions on our previous podcasts, today's show returns to Blighty in time for the holiday season to explore the glories and wonders of England's mighty choral tradition. It's going to be a journey that will take us from music written from a boarding school in the 15th century to one of today's most talented English musicians, Anna Lapwood. I also haven't had to venture far afield to find my guest. In fact, no further than the end of my desk here at Presto Towers. David Smith, hopefully familiar to many of you as a member of Presto's editorial team, is also a lay clerk at St Philip's Cathedral in Birmingham, a member of the vocal group Ex Cathedra, and a journalist for Early Music America. When he's not preoccupied with these fine endeavours, his day job is heading the digital catalogue here at Presto Music. Welcome to the show, David Smith.
Hello, Paul.
Before we begin our chronographic choral adventure, David, could you give us a brief introduction to where your interest in English choral music began, and what your duties as a lay clerk involve?
So I've been doing this kind of music since I was about 7, I think. I joined the front row of trebles in the church choir at the church where I used to live in Prestbury on the outskirts of Cheltenham. I've been doing it pretty much ever since. So I went off to university. There was a chapel choir there, which was the same sort of thing. Actually, quite a small choir, which was quite nice compared to some larger ones. And then since moving up to these parts to work at Presto, I sang briefly at Warwick, which is a sort of cathedral standard choir, despite not being actually a cathedral. And then I've been at St Philip's Cathedral Birmingham since 2016, I think, as a lay clerk. And lay clerk is briefly just the word for the adult alto, tenor and bass members of a choir of that kind. There's all kinds of slightly whimsical names for this. They are vicars choral in some places, despite not being vicars as we understand the term. Lay clerks, we're not really clerks either. It's just that's the word that's come into use. And the duties are just to sing at whatever services are on the sort of the normal routine of the church or the cathedral. Depending where you are, that can be an awful lot or not so many. At Birmingham, it tends to be 4, 2 in the week and 2 on a Sunday. I'm aware of people, a former colleague of mine sings at York Minster where there are 8, which is 3 on a Sunday and then 1 every day and 1 day off. So it can be very, very full on, or it can be a little bit less.
Well, we begin our journey just down the road from Windsor Castle. David, Eton College is famously a breeding ground for many a British statesman, but could it also be seen as the embryo for the English choral tradition? Could you introduce the Eton Choir Book and how it helped develop a uniquely English approach to choral singing, presumably derived from the world of Gregorian chant?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right to draw that connection with plain chant. A lot of music of kind of this period, we're talking pre-Reformation, so this is still Catholic England, has a sort of kernel of... It's kernel with a K. A kernel of plain song. So if you think of a normal plain song sort of melody, if you stretch that out till it's unrecognisably slow, sort of in semi-breathes almost rather than in crotchets or in quavers, and you then use that as one line in a piece of music, it's called the cantus firmus, and then you sort of construct other parts around it. And this is very, very common, not just in England, but sort of, I think, across the whole Catholic world as it was then. And the Eton Choir Book is not so much an embryo as it is, I think, a kind of time capsule. Because obviously when the Reformation came along and we had, successive waves of Puritan iconoclasm, not just in music but elsewhere, you think of all these churches where it's whitewashed and then, it's renovated. It's sort of somebody discovered in 2006 that there's been an amazing fresco or something underneath. Statues, I think, removed. Some organs taken out and smashed up. And one of the other things that was a casualty of this was this sort of very Catholic tradition of music, because it's so far removed from what you think of as Tudor music. There is sort of, if you think of the well-known little anthem by Purcell, part of his funeral music for Queen Mary, Thou knowest, Lord, the secrets of our hearts. It's very, very clear. The opening is literally, Thou knowest, Lord. You can hear exactly what's going on. But in this earlier style, that couldn't be further from the truth. You have monumental textures and phrases that go on and on and on, just on one syllable sometimes. You think it might be an entire page of the A of Alleluia or the Sa of Sanctus, something like that. I remember noticing this in Taverner's Missa Gloria Tibi Trinitas, which is a enormous piece of 45 minutes long if you do the whole thing. And it's just, you get the sense that he wasn't really setting the words in any meaningful sense. He was sort of responding to them and then just spinning something, almost absolute music, just spinning something magnificent out of these words, leaving the words themselves far behind. Because, of course, at this point, the music wasn't for the edification, much less the entertainment of the congregation. They didn't need to know what was going on. That's not really what church was about then. It was quite literally, soli Dei Gloria, just for the glory of God. But then, with the change in sensibilities and the change in theology, I guess, with the Reformation, a lot of that stuff was just destroyed and lost. And so the Eton choir book is, I think, the best known and possibly also the first discovered, or rediscovered, not 100% sure about that, of sort of the remaining sources of this stuff. I think it was just in the library at Eton and overlooked by everybody for some time. There are others. There's one at my old college, Peterhouse, I think, in Cambridge, Peterhouse Park Books. There's one up in Durham. But this is the most complete. And I say complete in the sense that, a paleontologist would recognise the term. You don't have a complete skeleton of a dinosaur. You have one that is just less incomplete. But it has composers that we don't really hear of these days. So there's Fairfax, there's Cornish, there's Wilkinson with a Y, Mundy as well. And it's just sort of, I think we're so lucky that any of these escaped, I think literally escaped the flames. Because otherwise this whole chapter of sort of the church's musical history in England would have been lost forever.
Well, we haven't got time to play the whole Eton choir, but we do have time for an excerpt. This is John Nesbitt's Magnificat, performed by the 16 and Harry Christophers. The Reformation brought religious conflict to Europe, although, as David mentioned, the Eton choir book was fortunately spared Henry VIII's dissolutions of the monasteries. And in England, the conflict was played out both in the realm of politics and in music, with Thomas Tallis and William Byrd being so dominant Queen Elizabeth gave them a joint monopoly on polyphonic music, especially remarkable given the fact that both Tallis and Byrd were themselves Catholics. How does Tallis's most famous work, his 40-part motet Spem in Alium, manage to cross the Protestant-Catholic divide? And would it be fair to call it, alongside Shakespeare of course, England's greatest contribution to the Renaissance?
I think it's certainly a contribution, and it's also a culmination, I think, of a lot of sort of trends and desires, not just in music but elsewhere. The sort of factoid or popular myth surrounding Spem in Alium, which I don't know is true, nobody's quite sure, and it's very difficult to be sure, but it seems quite reasonable, so I'm just going to run with it, is that Henry VIII built this magnificent palace, Nonsuch Palace, which was in part an attempt to sort of show the continent that England was every bit as cultured and, could produce something every bit as magnificent as anything they had the other side of the channel. It's not there anymore. I think it was torn down to pay off the debts of the mistress of some Georgian monarch. Can't quite remember, but it's something like that. But while it was standing, it had these very distinctive octagonal towers. And it's thought, because these had 2 floors of galleries inside them, it's thought that Tallis's Spem in Alium may have been composed with those in mind as a venue, and possibly even first performed there, because the 40 parts are divided into 8 choirs of 5, which obviously lets you do all sorts of nice things with sort of spatial arrangement, and it gives a very impressive experience like that. The sort of relationship that between the Protestant and Catholic music is quite an interesting one. I think Tallis and Byrd both had to sort of tack with the prevailing political winds, as, there's this great tug of war between Protestant and Catholic over this whole period. And they both showed that they could kind of turn their hands equally well to either. There are certainly some works, particularly by Byrd, that are very much in the vein of sympathising with the Catholics who had, as it were, been trapped the wrong side of the border when the wall went up. There's this sense running through some of it of kind of how should we sing the Lord's song in a strange land kind of thing, being abandoned and calling on God to deliver them and, bring them back into the fold. And so there are things sort of playing on the various biblical things where, Jerusalem has been laid waste and destroyed, and it's sort of lamenting that and taking that as an inspiration. So there's a thing by Bird, which is exactly that. It's sort of, how does the city sit solitary? Everything is abandoned and in ruins and that kind of thing. And yet also there are things that are much, much more Protestant in their musical sensibilities. There's Talus's If Ye Love Me, which is a very nice little, very short anthem. And it's like that Purcell one I mentioned before, although obviously earlier. It starts with very simple block chords. Language is in English, which is itself significant. Yeah, so it was clearly possible for composers to do both, and they didn't seem to have any kind of compunctions about doing so. Speminalium is sort of in the middle. It's not consciously trying to bridge the divide, because I don't think that's a thing one would really have done in a kind of can't we all just get along kind of way. But it's definitely not partisan one way or the other. Text is in Latin, which is toward the Catholic side of things, but it isn't one of these we have been cut off from the church, when will we be delivered kind of things. The text is more just, what is it? I have never hoped in any but thee, O Lord, respect my humility. There's nothing quite so forlorn about it, and it doesn't have that sense of total desolation that you get in some of the other Catholic music. So I think it is, kind of in the middle. In terms of what it's trying to articulate.
Okay, well, while we can't recreate the acoustics of its original venue, we hope that wherever you listen to this performance of Talus's Speminalium, performed by the Aura Singers and Susie Digby, you do enjoy it. Despite their monopoly, Talus and Bird weren't the only choral composers in England at this time. Can you introduce Orlando Gibbons and his CC, The Word is Incarnate?
Yes, so this is, I think, a little bit later, maybe a generation or so, but it's the same sort of time period. This is an example of something called a verse anthem, which is, it's almost like a concerto in that it has a soloist and a tutti, which isn't that common in sacred music, really. It's sometimes literally verses, if it's setting verses in the Bible, but you have a solo section or a couple of soloists singing some of the text, and then the choir will come in and sort of respond or sing the next bit, which is obviously quite useful in purely pragmatic terms, because if the soloists are doing quite a lot of the heavy lifting, then that's so much less music for the rest of the choir to have to learn. This particular one I've chosen because it's a fascinating example of the text chosen. Most anthems, verse anthems and just anthems generally, are for a time or a season in the church year. Hooray, it's Christmas, Christ is born. Hooray, it's Easter, Christ is risen. This is all of the above. CC, the Word incarnate, is God coming into the world. It then does a whistle-stop tour through the entire story of Jesus' life, right up to the crucifixion and the resurrection, and I think also the ascension afterwards. And so you can kind of use it at any point in the church year when you fancy doing it, which is great because it's just such a great piece of music. But I think it's quite unusual in having that this is your life sort of approach.
Well, let's have an excerpt of a certain part of Christ's life performed by the Stele Anticho and Fretwork. it be fair to say, David, that due to the Protestant-Catholic divide, the English choral tradition has now inherited the best of both worlds, the glorious large-scale works by Tallis that has helped create the Anglican tradition, and also the more small-scale groups like the Gesualdo Six, that are the result of some of Byrd's perhaps more intimate music?
I think it would, and the best sort of example of that is the fact that we're able to just use Protestant and Catholic music without anybody really batting an eyelid. I think this is also true, very much true in the Catholic Church. There are very few places left that will, turn their noses up at Bach because he was a Lutheran. But it's always been true, and I think it's just inherent to the way the Church of England took shape, this kind of big tent, don't look too closely, papering over the cracks kind of compromise.
The theological fudge, shall we say.
Yes, and it's but you will quite often have, a service where there's a mass setting by Palestrina or Victoria. Certainly a voluntary is likely to be something by Bach. Hymns will come from all over the ecumenical shop. And anthems as well. And it's never really been seen as any kind of negative, so we really do have the best of both worlds. And, as you say, also the sheer size and the variety in sizes of choirs is something that I think we can attribute that also to this sort of mixed heritage, because that more intimate group, I think, probably has its earliest roots in Catholic music making in Haydn, but also music making in the household generally, where obviously you have, parents and a couple of kids maybe, and that's it. So there's always been music written for those kinds of forces, and it's still with us now alongside the larger stuff.
And as an example of the smaller scale music, here is Lullaby My Sweet Little Baby by William Byrd, performed by the Gesualdo Six. The early English Baroque was dominated by a singular genius, Henry Purcell, who held the position of both organist at Westminster Abbey and composer at the Chapel Royal. What from his extraordinary output have you selected, and how did he build on the tradition he inherited from Tallis and others, while at the same time develop a unique musical style?
Well, the piece I've picked is actually not the best representation of the things that Purcell, the most obvious innovations in his style. I think he drew a lot on French music and that sort of slightly courtly, dancey feel. It's very much evident in things like Dido and Aeneas, some of the dances in that. Less so, I think, in his sacred music, but this particular piece, which is Hear My Prayer, O Lord, is not courtly or dance-like at all. It's very subdued, and it's for, the slightly darker times of the church year, Lent and periods like that when the sort of thoughts turn to slightly more reflective side of things. But yeah, I mean, he was just almost sort of unique and standing by himself for a very long time, and there isn't really much of a school around him, a Purcell school, if you will. And so, yeah, you do get this sense that he was uniquely able, I think, to draw all kinds of things together, French, Italian, into a style that just, you instantly know it's Purcell when you hear it, as I think we're about to.
Well, this is Purcell's Hear My Prayer, O Lord, performed by the choir of St. Thomas's Church, 5th Avenue, New York, the Concert Royal, conducted by John Scott. The late 17th century in which Purcell lived was a period of rapid colonial expansion, and this recording is from the colonies, albeit the one that got away. To what extent are choral traditions in places such as America, Australia, and even Africa influenced by the English Anglican tradition?
In the simplest possible terms, it is basically that wherever the flag was planted, the church soon followed. This was a central part of what imperialism was about, whatever you may think about that one way or the other. And so, to this day, there are Anglican-derived traditions right across the world. So there's Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the Episcopal Church in the US approaches services in much the same kind of way. And even in places that might not seem so obvious. So there are cathedral choirs maintaining this kind of tradition in India. There's one in Mumbai Cathedral. There's one in Uganda, in Namirembe Cathedral, which I hope I've pronounced correctly, where I discovered this choir completely by chance a few months ago maybe, on YouTube. And the fascinating thing is that they are singing the same kind of repertoire, psalms in the Anglican sort of way of singing psalms, which we'll come on to a bit later, but in their own language, not in English. The language I think is called Luganda. And also like some anthems and motets that I recognise. I know exactly what it is, but it's been translated into their native language. And obviously I think this is absolutely in line with what the Church of England is about, and more generally, Protestantism and the use of the local language rather than the language of, some distant power thousands of miles away. There's even still a choir in this tradition in Hong Kong. I think it's St John's Cathedral. The chap I used to sing with at Birmingham was a student who'd come over from Hong Kong, and he'd sung in that kind of style, sang with us for a couple of years, and has now gone back there. So it's very much alive. Anywhere that at any point has been even slightly British, there will probably be somebody doing this kind of music.
But adopted and adapted to the local culture themselves.
Yeah, very much so. And I think it's interesting that a lot of places that have decisively rejected most of the heritage of empire, becoming independent.
The political
sort of
aspect of empire.
Yes, indeed. They've, in some cases, have held on to this, which I think is interesting because, they could perfectly well have thrown this stuff out at the same time. And, perhaps they would have had every reason to. But in many cases they didn't, and I think that says something about the value of it that goes beyond just the white man's burden, if you will.
When Purcell died of pneumonia after his wife refused to let him in after coming back late from a night on the tiles, aged just 36, English music was left bereft of native talent, and England became heavily reliant on imports, both politically and musically. The anthem Zadok the Priest, initially composed by the Saxon Handel for the coronation of the Hanoverian George II in 1727, and wisely used ever since, is a fine example. Here's an excerpt performed by Gabrielli, conducted by Paul McCreesh. David, have you got some anecdotes from the time after Handel's death in 1759, when England was perhaps accurately described as Das Land ohne Musik, the land without music? And would it be fair to say that it was the English choral tradition which helped keep English composition alive during this time, when instrumental composition by English composers seemed to be in the doldrums?
Well, the Land ohne Musik is a very interesting sort of theory, and I think there's been an enormous amount of ink spilled over it. I think it's sort of a manifestation of that great man theory of history, which is all about, kings, queens, emperors, empresses. And it's certainly true that from Purcell until about maybe Elgar, there wasn't really an English superstar composer, a big name that everybody had heard of. And I feel like people interpret that to mean that there wasn't really anything going on, but clearly there was, because if there hadn't been an interest in music and an interest in what was new and what was exciting in the arts, we wouldn't have bothered importing all these foreigners in the first place. So I feel it's not quite a fair description, but it is, I think, true that there was a sort of fashion following element to it, as well as just art for art's sake. I think with England being, politically and economically and I suppose militarily quite a rising power at this point, the people who were doing well out of that would want to show that they were up in the latest fashions, and if that meant continental fashions, then so be it. That's where the exciting things were happening. So yeah, you have this delicious irony that one of the iconically British and I think English, arguably, pieces, Zadok the Priest, was written by a German immigrant.
For another German immigrant.
Well, indeed, yes. He was by no means the first. I think also the other one that springs to mind is a chap called Thomas Arne, who was writing about this time, wrote this opera, or I think it might be a semi-opera, called Alfred, which is sort of a patriotic thing about Alfred defeating foreign invaders. And you might be thinking, well, who's Alfred? Why do I care? Well, you care because the closing number, the absolute showstopper of Alfred, is a little ditty you might know called Rule Britannia. So from the period Ohne Musik, we have two, totally sort of immortal and iconic pieces. One of them written by a composer often seen as a bit of a one-hit wonder, and the other by a German who'd been brought in to supplement our own sort of lack. In terms of the choral tradition keeping things afloat, I don't know how much that's true. I mean, there were certainly, in the instrumental world, there were people like John Field, who I think it's generally thought kind of invented the nocturne, but didn't really do enough with it to become known as such. And then, people like Chopin sort of took on the baton. There were plenty of composers whose church music is still performed to this day, the likes of William Boyce, Thomas Atwood, Samuel Sebastian Wesley. So it certainly was, things still were, ticking over, but those three names, I'm very much aware, will not be as widely known to people who don't have at least a finger in this sort of quite specific musical ecosystem. Nobody has heard of these people who has heard of just Handel.
Do you have a specific piece by any of these composers that you would recommend that would be worth checking out?
I mean, honestly, it is known for Rule Britannia, but actually the whole of Alfred is really quite good music from start to finish. It becomes a little campy in places, but, that's
part of the course.
There's plenty of other music that is at least as campy. And it's a really good, consistently tuneful, really enjoyable piece. The overture in itself is just magnificent. There is a recording of it available. I think the only one still around is on Deutsche Harmonia Mundi, which just, we're just piling up the layers of irony here. But it's a magnificent piece, and I really would encourage people to check it out.
Well, the late Victorian period saw the British Empire dominate the world through the industrial output of its dark, satanic mills. But in England itself, there was something of a religious reawakening through the Anglican revival, which in turn helped revive the fortunes of English composition. The music of Charles Villiers Stanford and the later Herbert Howells aren't particularly well known to the average British concertgoer, but are beloved by singers and devotees of English choral music, especially Stanford's Mag and Nunc, the Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis in B-flat. What role does the Mag and Nunc have within the Anglican service, and why is Stanford's setting so revered?
Okay, so sort of slight tangent here for a history lesson and sort of Bible study. The Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis are two prayers that are incorporated into the structure of Evensong, which is the evening service laid out in the Book of Common Prayer, which I think was originally intended to be like Vespers but not Catholic. So it's this sort of reflective, looking back on the day, that kind of service. The Magnificat is the song or prayer that Mary sings or says just before the Christmas story, when the angel Gabriel comes to her and says, "Be not afraid, you are going to be the mother of God." And she essentially says, "Great, fine, bring it on." And you have this sort of great prayer of sort of accepting the burden and sort of recognising that it's going to be, it's sort of, she'll go down in history, I suppose. All generations will call me blessed, and that kind of thing. The Nunc Dimittis is also from the Christmas story, so this is just after the birth of Jesus now. Mary and Joseph take him to the temple to have various, ritual and blessing things done with the newborn baby. And there is this elderly priest there called Simeon who has previously been sceptical that he will ever see the Messiah, doesn't think he's ever going to come. And an angel, I'm not sure if it's the same angel, says, "Ha, you of little faith, you will not die until you have seen the Messiah with your own eyes." So he's very old at this point. And they hand the baby Jesus to him to be blessed, or whatever you do, and he looks at him and he says, "This is the one I've been waiting for." And so he sings, or again says this prayer, "Lord, now you are letting your servant go in peace, for mine eyes have seen the Messiah." Sort of saying goodbye to the world and sort of grateful that he can finally sort of die, I guess. So these are both woven into the fabric of Evensong. You get them at pretty much every service, and they come as a pair. So that's where you get Mag and Nunk, like Cav and Pag. It's very rare to get one without the other. And what that means is that composers who've written settings of these texts tend to do them as a pair. So they'll often be in the same key. They'll often share musical material. In particular, quite often, there's a coda at the end of each prayer, which is the same words, which is "Glory be to the Father and to the Son," and so on. There are several Mag and Nunk settings where that end section is literally the same music. It's only even printed once in the score, and you have to turn back again to find it when you're doing it the second time. So this is where we get the sort of shorthand way of referring to these things is just composer in key. So you've got Stanford in B flat, Stanford in C, Stanford in A, Dyson in D, and so on. Yeah, they're a very uniquely Anglican thing because they're so sort of inextricably entwined with the way Evensong was put together.
Well, let's have an excerpt from the Magnificat in B flat, performed by Robert Quinney on organ, the Westminster Abbey Choir, conducted by James O'Donnell.
So the fascinating thing about Stanford in particular, I mean, as you say, things were at a bit of a low ebb before he came along. There is this anecdote about an anthem by Samuel Sebastian Wesley, who I mentioned a moment ago, called "Blessed Be the God and Father," which is very, very good piece, quite substantial piece. But there's this little line on the bottom of the score that's printed, to this day in the editions we use now, where it says that at the first performance on Easter Day, only a very limited choir was available. Only trebles and one bass, who was the Dean's butler. And, the piece works with those forces, but it's intended to be sung, obviously, by the whole choir. And if you think about that, Easter Day, that's one of the most, arguably the most significant, maybe the second most significant festival in the church year. And if on Easter Day you can't muster even, a token alto and a token tenor, that says something dreadful about the standard that things had fallen to. It wouldn't be fair to give Stanford all the credit for, sort of waving a magic wand and making everything okay again. There had been quite a lot of groundwork laid before him. A chap called Frederick Ouseley and the much better known John Stainer had been doing quite a lot of work in improving standards and bringing things back up. And then Stanford very, very much built on that with anthems that were much more ambitious, I think, than what had gone before. The other thing that's interesting about him is he was very influenced by the German school of composition, particularly Brahms. He was a big, big fan of Brahms. And you can hear it in some of his church music. He brings into church music structures that had previously been more associated with orchestral and instrumental music. Yeah, so form and structure and things like that. And then, obviously, right towards the end of his life, that was completely upended because the war broke out, the First World War. And Stanford, I think, was not just angry, but I think he felt very betrayed because he'd idolised this country. And then it had turned out not to be what he thought it was. I think he'd been looking too much at Brahms and maybe not enough at the Prussian military. But, and so there is this anthem he writes in 1914 as a direct response to the outbreak of the war, which is furious. It's "For lo, I raise up that bitter and hasty nation, which march through the breadth of the earth, to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful." And the setting of it is just, it starts with sort of almost billowing waves in the organ. And it's just, and you can tell he is just so angry at how things have turned out. But obviously, musically, the Germanness is still there in his music and can't be sort of purged quite that easily. But on a personal level, yeah, he was suddenly just, I think, shocked and betrayed that Germany would do this.
It's perhaps similar to the influence of the English Anglican tradition on the colonies. They take the cultural aspects but reject the political aspects.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that would be a whole nother discussion, but I think that there's probably quite a lot of truth in that. Yeah.
Herbert Howells made a massive contribution to English choral music, both in large-scale works such as his Requiem and Hymnus Paradisi, and in smaller-scale works such as the psalm chant you've selected. What is special about the way Howells sets the text to music in this piece?
So this was a really difficult choice because there is so much absolutely glorious Howells. Some of his, again, Mag and Nunc settings and some of his anthems are just magnificent, and they really do elevate this music that sometimes, with the best will in the world, can be a little bit workmanlike. There are some settings that you just kind of fill the gap. But Howells is just incredible and just such a work of art. But I thought I ought to restrain myself from those and instead give a little example of the psalm chant. So this is by no means unique to Howells. It's just that his setting is a particularly nice one. So this is a way of singing psalms which I think must have evolved out of plainsong, and certainly has still one key element from plainsong, which is the total lack of any prescribed rhythm. The rhythm is prescribed entirely by the words. If you think of the Allegri Miserere with the little in-betweeny bits of plainsong, it's just however many syllables there are, that's what you do. There aren't minims and crotchets per se. And so this is also the case in this Anglican style of singing, except it's now not one line, it's four. It's block chords, everybody moving together, and again, one syllable at a time going through clearly so you can hear what's being sung. It's a very efficient way of getting through a lot of text, because some of these psalms, even if you break them down into chunks, like Psalm 119, which is an absolute monster and goes on forever, even the chunks are quite long, and if you set them in the way that people set anthems, with maybe repetition and interludes and things like that, you'd never finish. So you have these settings where you have, it's only about 10 bars of music, written out in minims, but of course they're not really minims. And you have this slightly esoteric system of textual notation that tells you when to change note, and you all change note together. And that gets through the words fairly quickly, and it's also very quick to learn because you will use the same music for verse after verse after verse. It's not unheard of to change in the middle of a psalm, so if you've got one where there's a change of mood, where the psalm starts with, woe is me for woe is me, and then in the middle you get a sort of lightening of the spirit, and but it's okay because God is going to look out for me. At that point you might change from a minor to a major key in your psalm chant, but mostly it's one or a few chants for the whole psalm, which is very efficient for learning the music as well, because once you know what the chords are and how to read the sort of textual notation, that's it, you're done. But I wouldn't want to give the impression that there's anything sort of token about these settings, because they're a little bit like piano miniatures or even hymn tunes, I guess, because they are so condensed. There is nowhere to hide. Every chord, every progression has to count. It has to mean something. And I think this is why there are some of them that have become popular, I think like hymn tunes in a slightly different way. The tune itself is popular because people like where it goes and what it does. And this Howells one is a particularly good example of that. It's got a real sort of sense of, I suppose profundity about it. It's not just reciting the words. And the music really is elevating them in a sort of unique way.
Well, it's only a short piece, so we have time for a substantial excerpt from Howells' Psalm Chant in C-sharp minor, performed by the Trinity College Choir, Cambridge, conducted by Stephen Layton. Herbert Howells's music was greatly influenced by the tragic death of his young son, Michael. How did this affect his composition?
Well, I think very profoundly. There are numerous pieces in which he is sort of coming to terms with Michael's death. I think Howells wasn't religious per se himself. He's one of these people like Brahms where he's sort of vaguely spiritual but drawing heavily on religion. And there's a lot of his religious works seem to be trying to process what had happened through the medium of those religious texts, which I think he found a source of great comfort. But there's a lot of angst in his masses, his requiem, things like that. There is also, at the other end of the scale, there is the hymn tune Michael, which is one of the most popular, and it's just really, really beautiful, which I'm not sure if it was written in memory of Michael or written for him while he was still alive, but it's almost the nicest of all the tributes to his son. It's just this little hymn tune, which, you know, is sung thousands of times more per year than the larger scale works. But yeah, it was really quite formative on him as a composer. I know we talk about generally it's positive things that are formative, but so much of his music is coloured by coming to terms with Michael's death, and it took him a very, very long time to sort of work through that, and I think the music was a big part of that.
Much like Mark Twain, the rumours of the death of the English choral tradition seem much exaggerated. In fact, it seems to go from strength to strength, both at home and abroad, with carols from kings and a festival of 9 lessons and carols now an essential part of Brand Britain. The music of John Rutter has now formed an essential part of a tradition that is managing to renew itself, while at the same time remain connected to its extraordinary history. Can you briefly introduce the music of John Rutter and a particular highlight?
John Rutter is one of the most successful living composers, very, very widely performed, not just in Britain, but he's very popular in the US as well. The relationship that church singers have with him is an interesting one. There's a fondness, but there's also often a slight sort of scorn that this is a little bit beneath us sometimes. You know, if you're comparing the reaction somebody has if you say, oh, next week we're singing an anthem by Rutter, to if you say next week we're singing one of the great masses by Palestrina, which I think is a little bit unfair. Certainly some of his music I still to this day associate with singing in the choir when I was about to move from primary to secondary school. This is age sort of 10, 11. But, you know, I think it's written for that kind of use, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. So the piece I've picked is, I was a little bit naughty in why I chose this. I found a couple of years ago, somebody had compiled a spreadsheet of popularly performed pieces by Rutter down one axis, and then across the other axis, various things he frequently does in his music, which, if you were being nasty, you would call cliches, but I don't think they're really cliches. I'd call them Rutterisms. And so there's all these various Rutterisms, and, you know, tick, cross for which one has got which. And this piece ticked, I think, all of them. So it is scientifically proven to be the most ruttery Rutter that ever ruttered.
It is peak Rutter.
It is peak Rutter, yes. But in addition to being peak Rutter, I genuinely think it's one of his best pieces. There's something about it that is just incredible. It's What Sweeter Music, which is one of his carols. And I don't know what it is about it. There's something about the key, I think. It's in a sort of very rich, dark G-flat major. But just the first few chords, you really do feel yourself kind of sitting back, settling back into the music, and it's sort of enveloping you. And for all that people might say about Rutter, that is something you can't teach, I think.
Fantastic. Well, let's hear a bit of it then. So this is What Sweeter Music by John Rutter, performed by the choir of King's College, Cambridge, and conducted by Stephen Cleobury. Young composers like Anna Lapwood and groups like the Gesualdo Six are powering English choral music into the 21st century, with an increasing number of women now getting involved. Why was choral singing a predominantly male affair, and how is this changing?
How it got that way is quite complicated, and I'm not 100% sure, but what I understand to have happened is in the dissolution of the monasteries, if you'll cast your mind back, as it were, obviously all the institutions that had been providing religious, musical, secular education to promising lads and lasses from the local area all, shut down, had all their stuff nicked by the state. But somehow a lot of the ones that were male institutions managed to reopen themselves as sort of cathedral foundations and things like that, and therefore kept going. And for reasons I don't really know, most of the female ones, the convents, didn't. Whatever the reason is for that, what it meant was that for centuries, this kind of church music making was a man's game. You would have boy trebles, male altos, and, obviously, the lower down the voices get, they tend to be male anyway. There are exceptions. There was this tradition they had, let's see, I think it's mentioned in Far From the Madding Crowd, actually. It's sort of that kind of era of it's called the West Gallery tradition, because in a church you have east, regardless of where the church actually points, is where the altar is, and the back is west, liturgical west, if not geographical west. And there's often a gallery up there where during this period you'd have a band of a fairly motley selection of instruments, just whatever people in the area had and could play, plus, mixed up with the choir, so you'd have the hymns being performed by this vocal/instrumental mishmash ensemble. And that was much more egalitarian, like no qualms whatsoever about women and girls being in that sort of ensemble. And actually that's been revived a bit recently. There's been a few recordings of this kind of music and hymns from that kind of period by Maddie Pryor, of all people, who I think is better known to most people as the lead vocalist of Steel Eye Span, and a band called the Carnival Band. They're fascinating. They're just such a different take on hymns, and it really gives a window onto that style of music making. But in terms of the cathedral end of things, yes, this was a man's game up until very, very recently. I think I'm right in saying that among English cathedrals, the first choir that started letting in girl trebles was Salisbury in 1991, which is, when you think about it, astonishingly recent. And, since then, it's become much, much more widespread very, very quickly. And, hardly a month goes by now without another cathedral announcing that it's appointed its first female alto lay clerk. And girl treble choirs are much more common now. And what they tend to do is to complement the boys, rather than mixing all the kids together into one choir, which, if you just think of the ages and the way both the voices and the children themselves develop, would be total insanity. So you'll have a girls' choir that will go from 7-ish all the way up to 18. And, then you have girls who are about to go off, maybe even to music college, and the level of musicality they have is something you can't reasonably expect from a boys' choir, because the voice changes, and you're lucky to have a boy treble beyond 15. So it's just practical to keep them separate. There have always been, I think, since this started happening, there have been people who've been worried about the long-term future of boys' choirs, but I think the evidence of the last couple of decades should be quite reassuring that they're actually not really in any danger. There's an interesting question about the sound. A lot of people care very deeply about the sound of a boys' choir. And in the main, I think those differences have been exaggerated, but there was something very interesting happened the other week at Birmingham Cathedral. There is a piece of music that we've often done with the boys' choir, and it's a very sort of hearty piece, and has the sort of feel of, I suppose, Year 7 rugby on a Friday afternoon. And it just so happened that we used the girls' choir for it the other week, and musically the performance was better, more in tune, consonants, all those kind of things, but it didn't have the same feel at all of just however many, a dozen or so boys just completely going for it.
The boisterousness.
Yes, boisterous. Boisterous with a Y. If anybody's listening and knows of the piece Dyson in C minor, the Magnificat of Dyson in C minor, you'll know exactly what I mean. But that, I think, is the exception. In the main, I feel like the music really doesn't care who is singing it. But yeah, so now it is very much the norm to have a choir of girl trebles and a choir of boy trebles. Boy trebles. At, I think, probably the majority now of cathedrals. And recruitment has just never become a problem, I don't think. So there's no sense of these fizzling out. I think people worried that the boys might fizzle out if girls came along.
Surely there'd be more boys if the girls were involved as well.
Well, that might be true if you mix the choirs up, but then, that really does set the cat among the pigeons. I should just clarify, like, the recruitment among cathedrals and choirs of that kind has never been a problem. At the level of parish churches, it is a little bit less of a positive picture. I remember joining a front row of 10 when I was, whatever I was, 7, 8. And when I left, there were, I think, only 2 or 3 trebles left. And at that point, you have to either sort of transition to using adult female singers, which is a very different voice, or give up. And people generally don't want to give up. And indeed, the choir I used to sing in has the sort of demographic of a choral society, although is obviously nothing like the size. So the people who might come through from parish churches to cathedrals aren't there anymore. But I think the cathedrals just recruit straight from schools. We certainly do at Birmingham. A lot of cathedrals obviously have a school built in or built on, which they recruit from. But it's, yes, in terms of the cathedral tradition itself, I don't feel like there's any danger at all of any of it fizzling out for the foreseeable future.
Well, certainly not if talented composers like Anna Lapp would have anything to say. Here is her Onata Lux, performed by the Pembroke College Girls Choir, the Chapel Choir of Pembroke College, Cambridge, and conducted by Anna Lapwood. In conclusion, whereas the orchestral music scene can sometimes feel like a bit of a museum, choral music in England seems to be a hive of energy and creativity and is constantly managing to find a new audience. How does it manage to do this?
There's a lot of possible explanations for this, and I'm not sure how they make up the picture together. The short answer and the perhaps slightly glib answer is that you have to move with the times, you have to evolve or die, in music as in anything. It may be to do with the fact that church musicians are not quite as subject to raw market forces. This is something I became very aware of at the start of the pandemic, because obviously a lot of my colleagues, my musical colleagues, being mostly freelancers, their work just, dried up like that. But for people who are employed by cathedrals, that wasn't the case. And it struck me that we're actually the last surviving court musicians. If you think of, the wind bands and so on employed, by the Esterházys of Haydn's day and that kind of thing. It doesn't actually matter, at least not as directly, whether you have 50 people at Evensong or one man and his dog, because it's not about selling tickets and getting bums on seats. So I think that maybe allows a little bit more freedom than you'd have if you were programming, an orchestral concert series, and you've got to make sure that you hit certain beats, tick certain boxes that people will want to hear a certain number of symphonies and concertos that they know. If you want to try out a new anthem at Evensong, it matters a lot less if everybody hates it. So it allows you quite a lot more freedom. This is also true, I think, of sort of the early music end, who are sort of exploring in the same way as contemporary music, because a lot of it is digging up stuff that's been not performed maybe for centuries. And a lot of these little ensembles, they're very specific in what they set out to do, and it's really a passion project for them. And that means that all you need is a few philanthropic backers who really believe in your project, and you're set. Then you can have what we have now. We have ensembles specialising in lattice. We have the amazing Cupertinos from Portugal, who specialise not just in Iberian Renaissance polyphony, but in Portuguese Renaissance polyphony.
It's a niche within a niche.
It's nested niches, nicheception. But you can do that. Whereas if you said to somebody, "I am setting up a new orchestra that is going to perform, exclusively new music or exclusively
underperformed music,"
or even from music from 19th century South America, people would look at you like you'd gone mad, because the funding would be a nightmare. And it's sad that it comes down to sort of such brazenly capitalistic things sort of influences, but I think that is part of it. And so you see things like the late great Stephen Cleobury, who for every Carols and Kings commissioned a new carol, and that's a sort of a strike rate that is really enviable. And to be able to do that, and obviously then to bring it to a vast audience who you've lured in with the candles and once you're royal, and then you can smuggle past them some new piece that, you know, they may not like, but they may really love. And it's a really good way of getting new music to a much wider audience.
And finally, would you agree that since the subject matter and instrumentation of sacred choral singing predates even the Eton Choir book, which we discussed, all sacred music is essentially timeless, and so combining the old and new, like they do in Festival of Nine Lesson Carols, is actually far easier than it would be for other forms of music making?
Yes, I think sacred music has always had that sort of one eye on the past because of the fact that you are consciously keeping going and maintaining these traditions that have been going for, you know, hundreds, or depending how you define it, thousands of years, in a way that other kinds of music, you know, the past is obviously always there, and you can trace the genealogy of a certain composer, their musical genealogy, but it's never sort of quite so explicit. Whereas in church music and sort of church adjacent music like organ music, it's often really, really front and centre. So you remember we were talking earlier about that plainsong thing of building a piece around plainsong. Even after the cantus firmus stopped really being a thing that people used very much, the thread of plainsong goes through and through and through right up to the present day. It's evident in the Mozart Requiem, the soprano solo, Te decet hymnus Deus in Zion, quite early on. That is a quotation of a plainsong melody. You get it in De Rufflet, his Requiem, indeed, is extremely closely tied to plainsong. He's not just reharmonising the plainsong itself, but he is definitely making it explicit, like, this is my wellspring of inspiration, and he's putting it really on show. More recently still, there's a composer called Claudio Dall'Albero, who writes some of his music is very clearly sort of based on the Palestrina school of polyphony, you know, that sort of species counterpoint that you learn as a first year undergrad. And again, it's not pastiche. He's not trying to be Palestrina, but he's using those same techniques in a new way. And the most surprising example, I think, perhaps to some listeners, is Carl Jenkins in The Armed Man, which is 1999, I think that was. The middle section of the Kyrie is written in, again, obeying all those rules that he would have learned when he was studying music of Palestrina-style counterpoint. Partly, I suppose, to prove that he can, because even then there was a sort of a sense among some people that he wasn't maybe a real or a serious composer, but also just because it works musically. And right at the end of the very last movement of The Armed Man, indeed the very final chord is an open fifth. And I remember when I first listened to The Armed Man, I thought, oh, where's the third then? You know, you'd expect it to be a sort of nice, reassuring G major chord, because ever since, I guess, the Baroque, you've had a chord which has a third, whether it's a minor third or a major third, it resolves one way or the other. But the earlier style often doesn't, and it often resolves onto an open fifth, because that was considered the sort of aesthetically satisfying, complete way to conclude a piece of music then. And I don't think that's an accident when Jenkins does it. I think it is him consciously saying this is sort of, you know, this heritage is always still present in the music. Yeah, so it's just everywhere in a way that it isn't so much in other music, and even more so if you look beyond just music and look at texts, because obviously the texts that sacred music sets are very, very old. Again, you know, as old as the Bible in some cases, however old you think that is. It's not that common for a completely new text to be set. I mean, it's certainly not unheard of, but it's often new settings of the old texts, and that again is something that is a sort of unique fusion of the old and the new. You know, working together rather than the new necessarily having to fight against the old, as I think it tends to in other areas of music.
Fantastic. Well, I think we've demonstrated there that the English choral tradition has an illustrious past, and I'm sure it has an illustrious future. Is there anyone particular you'd like to thank, David?
Yes, indeed there is. I meant to do this earlier on, but I forgot. I'm incredibly grateful to Dr. Paul Rodmell, who is a friend and colleague at Birmingham Cathedral, but also a lecturer at Birmingham University, where he teaches a course that is on basically what we've been talking about. I think it's called the Anglican choral tradition, something like that. And I had a little chat to him when I was preparing this, and he was extremely forthcoming, extremely helpful. So that was just marvellous to be able to bounce the ideas off somebody who really is an expert in his field. So thank you, Paul, and thank you, Paul.
And thanks to Matt Groom for producing, and thanks to you for listening.